I think the set design probably influenced me a lot early on, and I got going sort of on that. I would say that over the last few years, I sort of look to that as an influence less than I used to. But definitely, like, it certainly as the paintings that are in this show are I find a lot of inspiration in the theater, I would say, and so that was a time when the influence was still quite strong. There's very theatrical aspect to the paintings. You know, they have these photographic sort of backdrops upon which I've sort of laid on these sort of filters. You know, these colors that sort of are almost like curtains, and folding in front of those backdrops. I mean, it's a dynamic that comes straight out of the theater. So I would say that. Yeah, the influence is there for sure. A theatrical relation is one where you're inviting an audience to sort of relate to what's happening. And so for me, that size invites a person to sort of like physically relate to what's going on. I mean, there's a depth of in the paintings that sort of invites an entrance, you know? It's sort of like the shape and size of a doorway. So I mean, for me, I've made paintings of that sort that were on a smaller scale, and they're really entirely different just because there's no relation to the body. But once you get to, in that series anyway, once you get to a certain scale and beyond, then all of a sudden you snap into this other relation, which is very visceral. It very much welcomes sort of entrance. It's a lot of photography being used in people's paintings in the last number of years. And so I guess I just decided to try my hand at that and see what I could do, you know. It ends up being very laborious. I mean, you can imagine if looking at them, knowing that it's all rendered in paint, that it takes a while, and it does. It's probably a week out of my life to like just get the photograph right, you know. But after, it's funny because for me, what I learned from that series, having had the idea and sort of making the paintings, I learned that the photograph was actually the part that I just slogged through. It wasn't that fun, actually. Copying a photograph isn't really that fun, particularly when you're really trying to be truthful to the image that in your hand, sitting in your hand. The colorful stuff that came afterwards was the more interesting stuff for me, and so it really kind of turned into something else at that point. Once the photograph was, I finished painting the photograph, then it shifted gears and turned into something, I guess, more abstract. You know, the more grid. There's a sort of like a snapping. The shapes sort of snap into the grid with sharp horizontals and verticals, and yeah, that's a different exercise altogether. I just wanted to make something really bright and colorful. It's funny because the photographs, you can look at a photograph and see and think that it's a colorful photograph, but it turns out when you actually start painting and copying those colors onto a canvas, there's like a million more grays and browns in a photograph than there is anything bright. And so I found that in the rendering of them, that I was kind of stuck in this palette of like muddy colors, and so it was really. Well, I mean, those are nice variations to explore too. I mean, that was interesting. But when I came to the second part of it, where I was going to apply that the color, I had the choice, like what I want, and I guess I just decided that something to really set that part away and apart from the photograph was one way to do that is to change the palette into something very different. So I wanted to use saturated colors. I just made it up as I went along. I had a bright palette sitting in front of me, and I kind of just went where my imagination took me. I think I'm just interested in space and something about architecture measures space. I mean, I grew up in the prairies, like out in the countryside where, obviously I lived in a house, but wandering around outside, I mean, it was really just open sky. I think maybe wide spaces are something that I grew up with and have been interesting to me. And so this idea of cutting up space and boxing it up, and I think is also consequently interesting, just because it's the polar opposite experience of living in the countryside. It maybe having architecture in the paintings is my way of sort of coming to terms with the fact that I live in boxes now, whereas I never felt like that before.